Hello. I want to talk to you about one of my dreams. So, one of the dreams that I have is to create a foundation. And now, a foundation is a funding organization that provides grants to particular demographics or projects. My top four demographics, and at best, those who intersectionally belong to several of these categories or identities, are single mothers, people who have experienced debilitating trauma or violence, trans and queer individuals, systems theory network interfacing strategic planners for intentional community projects and spaces. This includes health and wellness, permaculturalists, natural builders, alternative energy specialists, alternative education specialists, landowners, and community organizers. The collaborative dream, as I envision, is to co-create microcosmic instances of utopian healing and evolutionary examples of human collectivism that supports individuation. Projects that meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals or eco-villages, even temporary autonomous spaces like festivals, conferences, or klima camps all fall into this model. This is not a spiritual bypass and what's wrong with current attempts steeped in ethnocentric monoculturalism or monoculture, which, like monocropping, dismisses diversity, thus excluding the most vulnerable and often the most innovative from participation and visibility. And then they fail without healthy sustainability that is rooted in diversity. 90% of intentional communities fail. Those are the stats. This dream, this collaborative dream, is in recognition that women do 60% of the work and own 1% of the land. Those are the UN statistics. This is in recognizing that children are the largest demographic to starve. They experience homelessness, sexual slavery, and require education as a leverage point to escape repressive paradigms. This is in recognizing that by and large, women raise children. So rather than like modern US migration politics, which shadowed the redundant colonial practice of stealing children, we must support the mothers to support the children. This dream is for the sake of equity. Colonization is the root of many problems, and I don't just mean the global north's historical fixation with manifest destiny. I mean the internal rifts that have formed as a result of the oppressive takeover of religion, science, academia, and the free market by heteronormative patriarchal hegemony. Let's define a couple of those terms. Hegemony is like homogenous in that it means all the same. Like we should all be the same and not the unique snowflakes we actually are. This is so important to understand because it is essentially the matrix that we have all been plugged into and conditions the way that we perceive reality. It's actually commonly been referred to in social justice scholarship as the matrix of domination, because we are forced in subtle and obtuse ways into this narrow-minded hegemony or normative mold. Heteronormative is a great term to follow up defining because it means that we have been trained to think relationships only happen one way. A man with masculine roles, a woman with feminine roles, and a child. Let's take a minute to unpack this with a special focus on mothers and queer theory. Much of the dominant narrative constricted the purpose of women and sex to procreation. It went a step further to typecast mothers as non-sexual beings. Women were whores, and mothers were asexual. This is part of the patriarchal conditioning. This can be historically traced through the iconography of Mary, mother of Jesus of Nazareth, always portrayed as covered, idolized in fictions of purity as the perpetual virgin, the archetypal asexual mother. You rarely think of Mary as a single mother who was refused housing and ended up laboring to birth Jesus in a manger, a barn. We are too quick to hush discussions on how much she was the perfect epitome of how we as single mothers suffer and are rejected by the mainstream. Instead, she has been co-opted by the enemy to further suppress us. Much like Sita in Hinduism, held as the ideal woman in India, with her story steeped in being rejected by, but ever available to ruling class male contexts of justice. The primary term in heteronormative is normative. It doesn't just mean anti-gay, because as we see in gay and lesbian theory, they were at one point anti-bi, anti-trans, and anti-people of color. In fact, they still are. The normative mold still worked on gay people to support white supremacy and deeply conditioned fixation on the binary. They argued identity politics. I'm born this way and I just want to be accepted into the same institutions like marriage of the so-called heteronormative. Now, when someone comes along that says, I'm not a man or a woman, I am both a man and a woman, I'm attracted to men and women, I want to spend my life with more than one person, then we are really talking about a fundamental break from the heteronormative as we have been forced to understand it for millennia. Now, how do we as humans react to difference? Well, we are rewarded when we emulate or support the normative. Remember, normative does not mean normal. It means decidedly elitist, a social construct that follows domination schematics of divide and conquer. It's about power and control. Unclear what defines the normative: white, cis, which just means born in the gendered body you personally identify with, hetero, able-bodied, able-minded, adult, financially stable, speaking the dominant nationalist language, educated or literate. These are just some identity markers that have been typecasted as normative. Don't believe me? Well, I'm speaking from the privilege of education. This is a social science, not an opinion. Social justice scholarship incorporates psychology, anthropology, sociology, statistics, and religious studies, just to name a few. Here's one example. The more Anglo-Saxon your name is, that means John rather than Jerome, Joaquin, or Ahmed, the more likely you will be hired. It doesn't matter if it's the same resume, word for word. This study has been done multiple times, and the statistics show change your name to sound white American, and you have a better chance of getting a job. How about pay rates? Globally, white men are paid by and large more than white women, who are paid more than women of color. Heard the prison statistics? People of color, the statistical minority in America, but proportionally are the statistical majority incarcerated in these private, for-profit, school-to-prison pipelines. Everyone knows being a black parent in America means having to talk with your child about how not to get shot by a cop. Like, that is appropriate exposure for people who aren't even preteens. As soon as a 7-year-old was gunned down by a cop who didn't get in any trouble, I knew it was time to have this conversation with my 8-year-old. Imagine changing that to a discussion with the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white girl. Sound normative? So some groups are exposed to violence and have their freedom threatened by not fitting into normative social categories. They have little chance of changing fundamental aspects of themselves, like skin color, to mimic the normative mold. Still, we are all forced to assimilate, as much as humanly possible, a process of cultural genocide to gain social capital that will allow us to live peacefully and sustain lives in systems dominated by hegemony. Those that choose to truly say, I am, not a pre approved script, have historically faced violence, their blood, and slavery, often paving the path for those that came after to live lives with a modicum of additional freedom of self expression and self determination. Every person who was surprised at Trump as a president hasn't been paying attention. And with looming issues like climate change, we no longer have the luxury of sleeping through the resistance and pretending we are not culpable. Now is the time that we must all decolonize ourselves.